The air in the inner chambers was thick, heavy with the scent of incense that lingered long after the evening prayers had ended. The soft shuffle of slippers on polished wood floors and the faint rustling of silk against stone walls filled the silence, but it was the absence of warmth that pressed most heavily upon her. She sat at the edge of the long, mahogany table, a place reserved not for her, but out of necessity, so as not to upset the delicate balance of decorum that had been so meticulously crafted. The low murmurs of conversation around the table flowed like a distant river, unperturbed by her presence. Her hand, folded neatly in her lap, felt heavy with the weight of what was unspoken, how easily they ignored her, how she was relegated to this far corner, out of sight, but always within earshot. She had grown accustomed to it, this dance of hollow politeness, the veneer of respect that barely concealed the disdain of those who should have stood beside her. Even as they exchanged pleasantries, she knew her absence from the conversations that mattered was not by accident. When her name was mentioned, it was a mere formality, spoken as though it were nothing more than a whisper lost in the wind, as though her presence here had no weight at all. It had been so many years since she had been considered in the discussions of inheritance, the management of the household, the shaping of their future. Yet she had once held her place with ease, her name spoken with respect and the recognition of her rightful role. Now, it was as though she had never been part of the family at all. Her fingers lightly traced the edge of the teacup before her, the porcelain cool under her touch, but she made no move to lift it. The tea was always served last, always poured after everyone else had been attended to, a subtle but telling detail. The servant girl, with her downcast eyes, handed her the cup with a bowed head, the same practiced indifference she had seen for years. It was a simple gesture, but in that small act, there lay the cruelest form of exclusion, being treated as an afterthought, a token presence. The seat she had taken tonight was the one closest to the farthest corner, a place that had once been unthinkable for her, but now it felt like the only seat she deserved. She had once been seated with the elders at the head of the table, her voice heard and her opinion sought after. But that was before the tides of favor had shifted, before the quiet scheming had begun, before they had decided to push her aside. The family's hierarchy had become so entrenched that even the smallest shift in placement could speak volumes. To sit at the center was to be important, to sit at the edge was to be insignificant. She remembered, in stark contrast, how her presence had been a cause for quiet pride in the past, how her father had once looked upon her with a kind of silent approval, his strong hand on her shoulder. Now, there was nothing but absence where affection had once been. Her father, once a pillar of strength and leadership, had become a shadow of his former self, and his eyes, when they fell upon her, seemed to pass over her with a blank indifference. No longer did he see his daughter when he looked at her, but only a figure, fading in the periphery of his life. The dinner progressed in muted conversation, the clinking of chopsticks and porcelain marking time as the evening wore on. She listened to her family, their words flowing with practiced ease, as if they had rehearsed their roles 1,000 times. Her half-sister sat to her right, her presence a quiet storm, poised and confident, as though she belonged at the table, as though the seat she held was not just a physical space but the rightful one. There was no place for her at the center anymore. Her sister, younger, but now the favored child, moved through the night with effortless grace, her laughter ringing in the air like music, her every word an invitation to be part of the family's future. It was a future she had been shut out of, a future she no longer had a place in. Her sister's eyes met hers briefly across the table, but the look was fleeting, almost as though she hadn't seen her at all. It was the same look she had received from everyone in this room, eyes that slid past her, never pausing long enough to acknowledge her as anything more than a background figure in their lives. It was not overt, this dismissal, but it was no less painful for being subtle. The meal had become a routine, a carefully orchestrated performance in which she had no part. She sat quietly as the others talked, her presence nothing more than a formality, a piece of the scenery they had grown accustomed to. The familiar walls of the family home, with their dark wood paneling and finely embroidered curtains, felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. Every detail of the space seemed to mock her, from the high, polished ceilings to the carved wooden furniture, all of it standing as a reminder of the wealth and power that now belonged to others. The place she had once held, the position she had once commanded, was no longer hers to claim. Every small gesture, every look, every half-finished sentence, reminded her of how far she had fallen from grace. Even the air felt colder now, as though it had grown thick with the weight of the years that had passed since she had last been a force in this house. Her eyes lingered on the high windows that framed the garden outside, the ivy that clung to the stone walls as though it, too, were struggling to remain in place. The faint scent of jasmine floated in from the garden, but it did nothing to soothe the chill that had settled deep within her chest. She could hear the soft murmur of conversation around her, but it felt like a distant hum, barely reaching her ears. She had once been part of it all, once had a voice in these matters. Now, she was silent, a mere observer to the lives that unfolded before her. As the evening drew to a close, she remained seated, her hands folded neatly before her. The dinner had ended, but she had not been invited to rise. Instead, she watched as the others moved with practiced ease, their laughter and conversation fading as they retreated into their separate chambers. She stayed where she was, in the farthest corner of the room, her silence marking the distance that had grown between her and the family she once belonged to. It was here, in this moment of stillness, that she felt it most acutely, the absence of her place, the absence of her power. The mask of civility, of the family's carefully maintained harmony, had slipped. And for the first time in a long while, she saw the truth for what it was. She was no longer part of it. She was a ghost in her own home. The soft hum of the evening was punctuated by the clinking of fine porcelain as the family gathered for the annual ceremony of ancestral tribute. It was a ritual she had once been a part of, eagerly standing beside her father, the rightful heir in her own right. The incense curled upwards, thick and rich with the weight of centuries, but tonight, the air seemed thinner, colder. She sat at the farthest edge of the room, as always, her gaze lingering on the high table where her father and the elders of the family sat today. The seat beside her, once filled with the warmth of her mother's presence, was now empty, an absence that echoed louder than any words ever could. Her mother's sharp eyes never glanced her way anymore, no longer the proud figure who once gently guided her through the intricacies of the family's power. She had grown used to this subtle coldness, this invisible wall that separated her from her rightful place. It had been years since that first moment of realization, when the family's hierarchy had begun to shift without her noticing, and yet she still remembered it as if it had happened just yesterday. The memory of that day played like a shadow in her mind. It had been a quiet afternoon, the sun hanging lazily in the sky, when her father had called for a family meeting. She had sat at the head of the table, the seat that had once been hers by tradition, the seat where her voice had carried weight in their deliberations. She had looked to her father with pride, ready to listen to his next command, to help shape the future of their house. But that day, the future had not been hers to shape. As her father spoke, his eyes never met hers, always fixed on her younger half-sister, who had sat across from her with an expression of serene confidence. She had not understood it at first, why her father's gaze lingered on her sister, why his words had been so soft, so approving in comparison to the cold, clipped tones he directed at her. It wasn't overt, there were no sharp words, no arguments. But it was there, beneath the surface, a subtle shift that had gone unnoticed by most. She had felt it like a chill creeping up her spine, the first crack in the veneer of her place in this family. Her half-sister had been favored, though neither of them had said it aloud. The servants, the courtiers, even her own mother, everyone seemed to know it. Her sister was the one now in favor of their father's attention, and she, once the apple of his eye, had been cast aside. The realization had not come all at once, no, it had come slowly, like a trickle of water that had turned into a flood, washing away everything she had once known. But that moment, that afternoon, had been when the first seed of doubt had been planted, though she had not yet known how deeply it would take root. The ceremonial feast that followed had been a perfect display of the family's carefully constructed harmony, yet it had been here, amid the feasting and the laughter, that she first saw the full extent of her displacement. Her seat had been shifted once more, placed at the far end of the table, opposite her sister. It was a simple act, a subtle change in the seating arrangement, but it spoke volumes. The elders spoke to her with a gentleness that bordered on condescension, their words polished and empty, as though they were afraid of offending her. Her sister, on the other hand, had been praised, her every word met with eager approval, as though her presence was a gift bestowed upon the family. It was in that moment, as she quietly sipped her wine, that she realized the truth she had been avoiding. She had been pushed aside. Her name had been spoken only in passing, a fleeting mention, like a forgotten afterthought. They had moved on, and she had been left behind. She had no rightful place here anymore. Her mind drifted back to the many quiet moments before, when she had ignored the small signs, the dismissive glances, the subtle shifts in the way people spoke to her. It had always been there, lurking just beneath the surface, but she had never allowed herself to see it. Her mother's approval had come less often, her father's praise had grown colder, more distant. And now, as she sat at the farthest corner of the table, she understood that her place in this family was no longer one of importance. Even the servants, those who had once looked to her as a figure of power, no longer treated her with the deference they once had. The glance of a maid, her head bowed just slightly too much, the way the tea was served last, always after everyone else, were no longer mistakes. They were deliberate. The family had distanced itself from her, and she had been too blind to see it. She had been slowly erased, her presence no longer necessary, no longer wanted. A shiver ran down her spine as the cold realization took hold. This was no mistake, no temporary lapse in favor. This was deliberate. They had already chosen their heir. It was no longer her. But even in this quiet moment of acceptance, she felt something stir within her, a feeling she had not allowed herself to have for so long. A spark, small but growing, of anger. Of the injustice she had been forced to endure. She had always been taught to smile, to endure, to quietly accept her place in this family. But this? This was something else. She was not a puppet to be moved around, not a piece on their chessboard. She had a right to more than this. Her hand clenched around the wine goblet, the fine glass digging into her palm. The family's quiet whispers, their muted approval of her sister's every move, had done more than chip away at her. They had pushed her to the brink. But they would not have her silence anymore. She would not be ignored, not anymore. Slowly, deliberately, she set the goblet down. Her fingers lingered for a moment on the edge of the table, her eyes flicking to her sister once more. She had been given her place, her moment to shine, but what of her own? The question lingered in the air, as weighty as the silence around the table. Tonight, the family had shown their hand. And tonight, she would make them regret it. The soft rustling of silk against silk filled the air as the family assembled in the grand hall, the low murmur of conversation rising and falling in the background. The atmosphere was carefully curated, as always, an intricate dance of decorum and obligation, but today, there was an undercurrent to it that she could not ignore. She stood at the threshold of the room, watching as her family took their places, settling into their appointed seats with the ease of those who had always known where they belonged. She, however, had been left standing, as though her presence was an afterthought, her rightful place forgotten. The room was quiet, save for the occasional clink of porcelain and the soft murmurs of her family. She was supposed to take her place beside her father, as she had always done, yet today the seat remained empty. The servant girl, young and nervous, shifted her weight from one foot to the other, glancing between her and the vacant seat. The weight of the unspoken tension was palpable, yet the girl did not dare speak, her gaze flicking quickly to the head of the table. It was there that her father sat, his stern gaze fixed on the arrangements before him. His words, when they came, were directed to the other members of the family, his tone one of quiet authority. Yet when his gaze briefly swept across her, it lingered only for a moment, his eyes never meeting hers in the same way they once had. She swallowed the sudden ache that tightened her throat. She had been prepared for this moment, had known it was coming, but the sting of it still caught her by surprise. The seat that had once belonged to her, that had once been filled with the quiet pride of being her father's true heir, was now given to her younger sister. The weight of that realization settled heavy in her chest. It had been weeks, perhaps months, since she had truly felt like part of this family, but today, as she stood in the quiet shadow of the room, it became impossible to ignore. The deliberate shift of the seating arrangement was a quiet testament to her sister's rising prominence. Her father's gaze had fallen to her sister with an approval that he had never once offered her, a look that seemed to say everything without uttering a single word. The delicate tension in the air thickened, though no one dared to address it aloud. Her sister, poised and unbothered, sat easily at the center of the table, her presence effortlessly commanding the attention of those around her. The servants, the elders, even the guests, no one looked to her. It was as though she were invisible in her own home, relegated to the fringes of the family she had once belonged to. The ceremony of the family's ancestral rites, the marking of the New Year's rituals, was an important event, but it was clear who held the true significance of the evening. It was her sister who received the first offering of incense, it was her sister whose name was called first in the blessing, it was her sister whose praises were sung. The ritual was carried out with the same perfect precision it always had, but now, the word seemed hollow, and her place within the ritual was almost an afterthought. She could still hear the faint echo of the elders' voices, their words falling over her, but it was the weight of their gaze that held her. Her mother, too, had averted her eyes, her attention focused entirely on her younger daughter. The slight was not overt, not in the way one might expect, but it was there. The way her mother's hand had brushed against her sister's, the way her mother had stood just a moment longer behind her younger daughter as the family offered their respects to the ancestors, it was all so subtle, so quiet, yet it cut deeper than any harsh word could. There was no confrontation, no harsh reprimand. Everything was carried out with the same practiced grace, the same dignified silence. But it was all an illusion, a farce that she could no longer ignore. The space between her and her family seemed to widen with each passing moment. She had once been central to their world, had once been at the heart of every decision. But now, she was an outsider in her own home, the distance between them a widening chasm that no amount of polite gestures could close. Even the simplest of details, the way the servants served her tea last, the way her name was spoken as a mere afterthought, the way her father never once sought her opinion, these all piled upon each other, small pieces that formed a larger picture of exclusion. She had been told, time and again, that her place would always be secure, that her family would never forget her. But now, she saw it for what it was, the quiet manipulation, the slow erasure of her presence, all done under the guise of family duty, under the pretension of harmony. The evening continued, each moment stretching on longer than the last. She could feel the sting of her sister's effortless confidence, the warmth of her mother's approval, but it was as though those things had been withheld from her. She was not worthy of them anymore. Yet, as the evening drew to a close and the ritual ended, a strange calm settled over her. The realization had come slowly, over the course of many years, but now it was undeniable. She had been cast aside, left to play the role of a silent witness in a family that no longer had a place for her. She rose from her seat, her body moving with a quiet, measured grace, but her steps felt heavier than they had ever been before. No one looked her way as she left the hall, no one acknowledged her departure. It was as though her exit was as inconsequential as her presence had been throughout the evening. The heavy wooden doors closed behind her with a quiet thud, the sound reverberating in the silence of the hallway. She stood there for a moment, her fingers pressing against the cold stone wall, the chill of the night creeping into her bones. It was then, in the stillness of the corridor, that she realized the full extent of what had happened. She had been left behind, not with words, but with actions, silent, deliberate, and unmistakable. The question that had lingered in her mind for so long was now answered, and though the answer burned like ice in her chest, she could no longer deny it. She had been erased, and her family had already moved on without her. Yet, even in that quiet moment of realization, something shifted deep within her. She did not react in anger, nor in despair. Instead, a quiet, controlled calm settled over her. The mask she had worn for so long, the one of acceptance, of duty, now felt heavier than it ever had before. She would no longer play the role of the forgotten daughter. It was time to reclaim what was hers. The moonlight spilled in through the lattice windows, casting long, narrow shadows across the stone floor. She sat in the quiet of her chambers, the silence a sharp contrast to the din of the family banquet that had just concluded. The doors were closed, the servants long gone, and it was here, in the solitude of the room, that the truth she had avoided for so long began to take form. Her breath came slow, measured, but deep down, something was cracking, something long buried was pushing its way to the surface. She could hear the faint echoes of the evening, the laughter, the pleasantries exchanged, the subtle exclusion she had felt all too keenly. But it was not until she found herself alone, away from the prying eyes of the family, that the full weight of her circumstances became undeniable. The moment she had been dreading had arrived, though it had crept up on her so quietly, she had failed to see it for what it truly was. She remembered the day of her father's birthday banquet, the grandest occasion of the year. It had always been a day of family celebration, a day when everyone came together to show their respect for the head of the household. She had been proud, once, to stand beside her father, to see her name spoken with reverence by those who sought his favor. But that day, the table had felt longer, the faces more distant. Her seat had been at the far end, a place she had once occupied without a thought, but today, it felt different. It felt like a statement. She had watched as her sister, the favored daughter, had been placed at the center of the table, her every word met with smiles and nods of approval. The servants had hovered around her, offering her the finest wine, the freshest delicacies, all while she sat at the edge, unnoticed. Her father had been too preoccupied with her sister, his gaze never meeting hers, his praise always just beyond her reach. And then there was her mother, standing beside her sister as though she were the one who mattered, as though her own flesh and blood had never been part of this family's legacy. It was in that moment, as the delicate laughter of the evening filled the air, that she realized the truth: she had been replaced. It was not a dramatic shift, not a sudden upheaval, but a slow, quiet erasure, and it was in the subtle shifts of power, the positioning at the table, the way her name was mentioned only in passing, the way her father's hand never rested on her shoulder, that she saw it. She had always been taught to stand silently in the background, to observe, to remain composed. And for years, she had accepted it, even welcomed it. But now, it was as if she were nothing more than a decoration in her own home, her presence a mere formality to be honored without thought. The painful truth unfolded before her like a tapestry woven from 1,000 small details. The family's attention had moved on, and she was no longer a part of their plans. Her father's legacy, her birthright, had been handed over to someone else, someone who had come into the family through nothing more than the happenstance of birth. She had been cast aside, not by force, but by indifference, by a cold, calculated maneuver that had taken place beneath the surface, hidden behind the veil of family duty. The realization settled heavily in her chest, a weight that she could not shake. Her life, her place within this family, had been mapped out for her long ago, and now, it was being erased, piece by piece, by those who were supposed to be her own blood. Her hand rested on the edge of the small, carved table beside her, the cool surface grounding her, but she could not escape the feeling that she was being pushed further and further away from everything she had once held dear. Even the smallest things, like the way her sister was always first to speak, always the one whose needs were attended to first, served as a reminder of how easily she had been overlooked. There was no loud rejection, no overt hostility, but in the quiet corners of the house, in the spaces where no one else looked, the truth of her position became clear. She was not important. She was not needed. The family had grown accustomed to her absence, to the cold distance between them. But it was not just her family that had changed. She, too, had changed. Where once she had accepted her role, now she saw it for what it truly was, a cage, built with the finest silks and the most polished wood, but a cage nonetheless. The wound ran deep, and yet it was one that no one else would ever see. It was not a wound that bled, but one that festered in the silence between her and the people she had once called family. The weight of her father's neglect, the casual dismissal of her place in the household, had taken root within her, leaving scars that were not visible to the naked eye. As the night wore on, the laughter from the banquet hall seemed to fade into the background, a distant hum that she could no longer be a part of. The family had moved on without her, and in this moment of stillness, she felt it more acutely than ever. She had been replaced, not by force, but by the quiet, inevitable tide of time and power. Her heart clenched at the thought, but she said nothing. She would not confront it, not yet. She would play her part, just as she had always done. She would smile, bow, and remain the perfect daughter, the obedient one. But inside, something had shifted. The first stirrings of anger, of resentment, began to grow deep within her. She would no longer be content to sit in the shadows, to be ignored and overlooked. She had always been taught to endure, to accept her place, but tonight, in the quiet of her chambers, she realized that she no longer had to. The mask she had worn for so long was beginning to crack, and when it did, the truth of her own strength would be revealed. The family had gathered again, as they always did, for the weekly meeting that followed the morning rites. The grand hall was filled with the usual low murmur of conversation, the clink of teacups, the rustle of silks and brocades. But today, something felt different. She stood by the door, watching as the family settled into their places. As expected, her sister took her seat at the head of the table, her posture perfect, her movements graceful, and as expected, her name was called first by their father, who greeted her with a smile of approval. He had done this for years now, his gestures no longer new, no longer a sign of affection, but of a pattern long established. Yet today, she could no longer ignore the weight of the truth. She had no place here. The seats at the table were always carefully assigned, each one a reflection of the family's rigid hierarchy. She had once been seated beside her father, her rightful place, where her presence had been acknowledged, where her opinions were sought after. But now, the seat beside him was empty, replaced by her sister, who had assumed the role that should have been hers. Her own seat was further away, tucked in a corner, a mere formality in the grand scheme of things. She had seen the subtle changes over the years, the way the family's attention had shifted, the way her role had diminished. But today, as she watched the others take their places, it became clear that she had been pushed out. Her father's gaze lingered on her for a brief moment, but there was no warmth in it. It was a glance of polite recognition, nothing more. Her sister, by contrast, received not just approval, but admiration. Their father's eyes softened as he looked at her, his words full of praise, the tone of a man who saw her as the future of their house. It was all too much to ignore now. She had been discarded. It was a truth she had known, but never truly accepted. The family had moved on without her, and as they all settled into their positions, she realized that the distance between them and her had become a chasm too wide to bridge. The coldness in the air was palpable, thick with unspoken truths. She could feel it in the way the servants moved with practiced indifference, in the way her name was barely mentioned, a passing reference at best, in the way her sister's name was spoken with reverence. Her own place in this house, in this family, had been erased. And yet, even in the face of this truth, she did not speak. She did not protest. She simply stood there, watching the others, feeling the weight of their attention shift away from her, feeling the pull of her own silence. The dinner proceeded as it always did, a series of formalities carried out with careful precision. There was no confrontation, no loud words to mark the distance between them. But the actions, the small movements, the subtle shifts in the way people interacted with her, these spoke louder than any words could. The seat at the table, once hers by right, now belonged to someone else. The decisions, once made in consultation with her, were now made without her. She was not even a part of the family's future. She was an afterthought, an inconvenience, a shadow in the corner of the room. As the evening wore on, the realization settled in like a weight on her chest, a heavy, suffocating truth that she could no longer ignore. She had been replaced. Her place at the table was no longer hers to claim. The family had moved on without her, and she was no longer a part of their world. She had once thought she belonged here, that she had a right to stand beside them, to hold her place among them. But now, she saw it for what it was, a lie. The realization was sharp, sudden, and it cut through her with a clarity that left her breathless. It was not loud, not dramatic. It was simply the truth she had refused to acknowledge for so long. And now, she could no longer deny it. She had been pushed aside, not with a loud declaration, but with a quiet, calculated movement, the kind that left no marks, no bruises, but tore through her nonetheless. She remained standing, unmoving, as the others continued to converse, oblivious to the internal battle that raged within her. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept them clasped firmly in front of her, refusing to let anyone see the weakness in her. She did not speak, did not ask for her seat, did not protest. She simply waited. But with each passing moment, the truth became clearer. She had been replaced. And she could no longer remain silent, not when her heart burned with the injustice of it all. She had been a part of this family once, but now she was nothing more than a forgotten piece in a game they had already won. She glanced at her sister once more, her gaze lingering for a brief moment. There was no malice in her eyes, only the quiet acceptance of what had happened. Her sister, so confident, so sure of her place, had everything that had once been hers. And now, it was too late to reclaim what had been lost. She turned away from the table, her steps slow and deliberate. The air around her seemed to tighten, the walls of the hall closing in on her as the weight of the realization took hold. She did not look back. She could not. The door behind her closed with a soft click, sealing her away from the family she no longer belonged to. The sound echoed in the empty hall, and for the first time in years, she felt the full weight of her absence. The silence in the room seemed to stretch longer than it should. The familiar sounds of the house, the soft creak of the floorboards beneath her feet, the low hum of distant conversations, felt muffled, as though they were happening in a world far away from her own. She had entered the room and stopped at the threshold, the sight before her settling into her mind like a stain that could not be erased. The desk, once hers, now sat untouched in the corner, its contents rearranged, its papers not her own. The familiar scent of incense had been replaced with the sharper tang of fresh flowers, a touch she had never chosen. Her heart tightened in her chest, and for a moment, she stood still, unable to move, as if the air had thickened around her. Her hand lingered on the doorframe, the smooth wood cool against her skin. She had once filled this space with life, with purpose. Now, it felt hollow, like a room that had been abandoned by time itself. The position she had held in the family, the small yet crucial role she had played, was no longer hers. The space had changed without a word being spoken, without a single confrontation, yet everything about it now screamed her absence. The furniture, once arranged with a certain respect for her, now seemed careless, thrown together with no thought to the person who had once occupied this place. She stepped further into the room, her gaze flickering over the small details, the way the papers were stacked neatly, the way her personal items had been moved, as though someone had come in and decided it was no longer hers to claim. The small decorative trinkets she had once placed with care on the shelves were gone, replaced by unfamiliar objects. A soft, bitter smile tugged at her lips. It was as if they had swept away all traces of her, leaving only a space that was now foreign to her. The realization, cold and final, pressed down on her chest like a weight. This room, which had once been a sanctuary, a place she had built with her own hands, no longer belonged to her. She was no longer the one in control here. She turned away from the desk and moved toward the door, her steps slow, measured. She did not look back. The hallway stretched out before her, its walls once a comforting presence, now felt like a maze leading her away from the family she had once been part of. The familiar wooden doors, once a symbol of her importance in the house, now seemed distant, impassable. She walked past the servants' quarters, her movements as quiet as the air around her. Not a single servant stood at attention as she passed, no one stopped to bow or acknowledge her. The routine, once a part of her life, had changed. The gestures of deference that had been automatic were now absent, and the knowledge hit her harder than any harsh word could. She was not important here anymore. She had been replaced, her presence reduced to an afterthought, her place in this family erased without fanfare. As she reached the main courtyard, her footsteps faltered for a moment. The garden, once a space she had tended to with great care, was now blooming with new life. Yet it felt foreign to her, as though it too had grown without her. The carefully pruned bushes, the pathways she had once walked barefoot upon, now they seemed like remnants of a life she could no longer claim as her own. She stood at the edge of the garden, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her fingers digging into the fabric of her robes. The world around her had changed, but it was not the world that had shifted. It was her. She had been left behind, not by force, but by design. The subtlety of it all was what made it sting the most, the cold dismissal, the empty spaces where she had once been. She had been replaced, and there was nothing she could do to undo it. A breeze stirred the air, rustling the leaves of the trees, but it did little to ease the weight that had settled within her. She was no longer the center of this family. She was no longer the daughter who was cherished, the one who had stood beside her father. All that was left was the faint echo of what once was. The thought that had been growing inside her, the truth that she had tried to ignore, now settled heavily. In her mind, she had been erased. Her place in this world had been taken, and there was no room for her anymore. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to push the suffocating reality away, but it was useless. She could feel it in every step she took, in every action that was no longer hers to control. Her gaze moved to the distant door of the family's main hall, its elegant frame standing tall against the backdrop of the garden. That door had once been the entryway to her future, the threshold through which she had walked with pride. Now, it was a barrier, a reminder of the distance that had grown between her and the family she had once been part of. She had been excluded from their future, pushed aside without a word. The realization hit her again, sharp and unforgiving. She was not a part of this family anymore. She was nothing more than a forgotten figure, a shadow in a house that no longer wanted her. She turned away from the door, from the garden, and walked back into the house. There was no anger in her, no bitterness in her steps. She had long since learned that there was no point in fighting against what had already been decided. Her place in the family had been taken from her, not by her own hand, but by those who had once called her their own. The silence that had settled in her heart now echoed through every step she took. She had been pushed aside, not with a fight, but with a quiet decision, and it was in this silence that she found her fate. She was no longer a part of their world. And the door that had once held so much promise now closed gently behind her, the soft click of the latch marking the finality of it all. The house was still, the usual hum of activity that filled its halls now gone. Her footsteps echoed in the silence as she moved quietly through the corridors, the dim light of the lanterns casting long shadows against the walls. She paused for a moment at the entrance to her chambers, her gaze lingering on the familiar, but now foreign, space. It was no longer hers, not truly. The scent of incense had faded, replaced by the sharper tang of the flowers her sister had placed in every corner. Her belongings, once neatly arranged with a sense of order, had been shifted, scattered, replaced. There was no need to linger on these things. They no longer mattered. Her eyes, cold and steady, moved over the room with the calm of someone who no longer sought approval or recognition. The place had changed. She had changed. She stepped inside, her hand reaching for the small wooden box that had once been a symbol of her position. It had been placed on the shelf where she could easily access it, a token of her place in the family's hierarchy. Now, it was buried beneath piles of cloth, ignored and forgotten. She retrieved it without hesitation, her fingers brushing over the delicate carvings on its surface. It was a simple thing, but to her, it had once been everything, her inheritance, her future. Now, it felt like nothing more than a relic of a time that had passed, a time when she had believed she still mattered. She sat at the small desk, the familiar weight of the box in her hands, and opened it. Inside, the faded pages of the family records lay carefully preserved, their ink smudged in places where time had worn away the delicate strokes. She ran her fingers over the pages, her thoughts distant, calculating. This was not an act of nostalgia. It was an act of preparation. She had once hoped to preserve her place, to hold on to the semblance of the life she had known. But now, she knew better. There was no going back. The pages before her were no longer a promise of inheritance, they were a map of her past, one that had been carefully erased. The carefully crafted web of family ties, of rules and customs that had once protected her, now held her captive. She could not change what had already been done. The world she had once known had shifted without her consent, and now, all that was left were the cold, hard facts of her position in the family. She placed the box back on the desk and stood, her gaze drifting to the window. Outside, the garden stretched out, bathed in the soft light of the evening. The flowers, once her pride, were now only a reminder of everything she had lost. The house, the family, her very place in this world, it was all slipping away, one small piece at a time. But it was not over. Not yet. Her hand moved to the drawer beside her, where the contracts and agreements lay hidden. They had once been her safety net, a symbol of her position in the family. Now, they were just pieces of paper, words that held no real power. But they were hers, and that was enough. She took them out one by one, her eye scanning the contents with a sharp, calculating gaze. She no longer saw them as symbols of her loss, now, they were tools. Tools she would use to reclaim what had been taken from her. The thought was cold, but it was clear. The family's loyalty had shifted, their allegiance no longer hers to command. But she would find a way to take back control. Slowly, deliberately, she began to fold the contracts, stacking them neatly in front of her. Each fold was a silent declaration, each movement a quiet promise to herself. She would not be forgotten. She would not be erased. It was not rage that burned within her, nor desperation. It was the calm of someone who had finally accepted the truth, the sharp clarity that came with knowing the rules of the game. She would no longer be the discarded heir, the forgotten daughter. She would rise again, not by pleading for recognition, but by taking what was hers. She closed the drawer and stood, her eyes flicking to the door. The family was gathered again in the main hall, their laughter faintly drifting in from the distance. They would not see her as she was now, not yet. They would still believe her to be the quiet figure, the one who had quietly accepted her fate. But she would not be that person any longer. As she left her chambers, her steps were measured, sure. The familiar hallways no longer felt like a prison, they felt like a battlefield, a place where she would find her way back to the center of power. She had not been forgotten, not in the way they thought. She had been waiting. Watching. Now, it was time. The halls that once seemed so oppressive now felt like they were opening up before her, the distance between her and the others no longer a chasm, but a path. Her gaze moved over the faces of her family as she entered the main hall, her presence no longer one of submission, but of quiet resolve. Her father's eyes flickered toward her, but there was no recognition in them, only the polite acknowledgement of a daughter who had been forgotten. Her sister, seated at the head of the table, did not look her way. But that was fine. She no longer needed their recognition. Her hand rested gently on the back of her chair as she took her seat at the table. It was not the seat she had once occupied, but it was enough. The others continued with their conversation, unaware of the shift that had taken place, unaware of the change in her. She would not demand anything from them. She would not call attention to herself. She would let them continue in their ignorance. But the table had shifted. And so had she. The family gathered once again in the main hall, the heavy curtains drawn back to let the golden light of the afternoon spill in. It was a familiar sight, the long table filled with faces that no longer held any meaning for her. The subtle sounds of the servants attending to the preparations, the soft clink of tea cups, the laughter that always seemed so distant now, it all blurred together in the background, like a scene from a world she had once known, but no longer inhabited. Her sister sat at the head of the table, her place at the center of the family, and her father beside her, his gaze never wavering from the table before him. The room, once filled with her presence, felt full of strangers now. Yet, in this silence, in this very disconnection, something had shifted. She sat at the far end of the table, as she always had, but now it felt different. No longer a bystander, no longer waiting for the approval of others. She was no longer bound by the family's expectations. They had taken everything from her, and in doing so, they had unknowingly freed her. She was no longer a part of their world, and for the first time in many years, the weight of it no longer crushed her. Her hand moved quietly beneath the table, brushing against the letter that had been placed before her earlier, the letter that carried the decision she had long since made but had not yet acted upon. The ink had dried on it, the words already set into motion, but it was in this moment of quiet contemplation that she realized the significance of it all. It was not just a piece of parchment. It was the key to her freedom. Her eyes drifted across the table, lingering on her sister for a brief moment. The woman who had taken her place, who had been given the future she had once thought was hers. The woman who had everything. And yet, the longer she looked, the more she realized how little she desired that future. No longer was she driven by the need for approval, for recognition. The role she had once craved now seemed hollow, meaningless. She did not want to return to this table, to be part of this family, not in the way she had been before. The path they had carved for her, the one she had once followed without question, was no longer the one she would walk. She could feel the weight of the decision she had made, the path she had chosen, the future she had accepted. Her life, her future, were no longer in the hands of her family. They had pushed her aside, made her invisible, and in doing so, they had given her the one thing they had never intended, freedom. She stood quietly, her movements deliberate but subtle. The letter remained untouched in her hand as she moved toward the small desk in the corner of the room. The family continued their conversation, oblivious to her actions. She placed the letter into the drawer, sliding it carefully away as if closing the door on her past. The heavy weight that had once hung over her seemed to lift as she did so, the finality of the decision settling in her chest. She had made her choice. She no longer needed their approval. She no longer needed their acceptance. She was no longer bound by their rules. As the others continued to speak, she turned and left the room without a word. Her steps were quiet, measured, the sound of her footsteps the only sign of her departure. She did not look back. The hallway stretched out before her, but it was no longer a path she feared. She had walked it too many times, but now, each step seemed to echo with the freedom she had claimed. She did not return to the chambers that had once been hers. Instead, she stepped out into the courtyard, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. The familiar sight of the garden, the flowers she had once tended, seemed to hold no meaning now. They were not hers anymore, not in the way they had been. And that was fine. The life she had once known was over, but it was not the end. It was simply the beginning of something new. She walked past the familiar places, the ones that had once held her captive. The door to her former chambers, the one that had once been her gateway to the family's world, now felt like a barrier, a reminder of a life she no longer desired. But as she walked away, she did not feel the sting of loss. She felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had taken control. She was no longer the daughter who had been cast aside. She was no longer the one who had been forgotten. She was free. The house, the family, the name, they no longer had a hold on her. And with each step, as she moved farther away from the past, she realized that it had never been about returning to the center of power. It had been about taking back control of her own fate. The door behind her closed softly, the sound barely reaching her ears. But in that moment, it marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Her past was gone, and with it, the ties that had once bound her to this place. She had left it all behind, quietly, decisively. The future was hers to shape now. What would she do with it?